some of the resources that I will be talking about today, as well as a link to join our Orchid US Community listserv if you want to stay in the loop with more of these types of webinars and other announcements and things related to Orchid. All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. So again, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Sheila Rabin, and I'm the Orchid US Community Specialist at Lyrasis. And our session today focuses on the benefits of Orchid membership for nonprofit organizations. So whether your organization is already an Orchid member or not, and whether you're at a university, a library, a funding organization, a research institute, or really any other type of nonprofit organization, this webinar is for you. So thanks again for joining us. And before we get started, just a reminder that this session is being recorded and will be shared with you afterwards. And if you do have any questions as we go along, feel free to type those into the chat and we will have time for Q&A at the end. If you experience any technical difficulties throughout the session, you'll notice that you can chat with Jonathan, our technical support specialist, and he will help you out. So moving right along, in terms of our learning outcomes today, this session has been designed so that after we conclude, you'll be able to understand the benefits of Orchid for organizations, identify ways that Orchid could be used to streamline processes in local systems and workflows, and conceptualize a plan for local adoption of Orchid at your organization, with knowledge of where to go to find more information. And so to get to these outcomes, we are going to cover the basics of Orchid, just so that we're all on the same page. We'll do a quick review of what is Orchid. We'll talk about the benefits of Orchid for organizations. We'll talk about how to benefit from Orchid, because there are a few things that your organization would need to do in order to benefit from Orchid. And we'll talk about how to plan for Orchid adoption at your organization. To give you a preview of the benefits of Orchid and why you should care, I've distilled these 4 main points, which we're going to cover in more depth a little bit later. But just as a quick overview to get us started, by using Orchid, organizations can uniquely identify researchers, streamline any reporting workflows that you might be using for assessment or gauging impact. So really any scenario where you're actively gathering information from researchers about the work that they're doing. Also, organizations can confirm their relationship to researchers, so it's clear which researchers are affiliated with which organizations. And ultimately, you can save time and reduce administrative burden, both institutionally and for your researchers. So what is Orchid? Let's do a quick review. Orchid stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. And the goal of Orchid is to uniquely identify researchers so that they can get credit and attribution for their work, while also allowing organizations to connect with their affiliated researchers and streamline the process of tracking and sharing information about researchers and their affiliations and activities. Orchid is a nonprofit, community-driven organization that serves the global research community, and it's supported by member organizations including universities, research institutions, publishers, funders, professional associations, and other stakeholders in the scholarly communication and research ecosystem. So Orchid's vision is a world where all who participate in research, scholarship, and innovation are uniquely identified and connected to their contributions and affiliations across time, discipline, and borders. So to meet this vision, Orchid provides a free, persistent digital identifier called an Orchid ID for researchers that also serves as a record of their affiliations, activities, funding, and works. So an Orchid ID is a 16-digit number that is unique to each person, regardless of what their name is or if their name changes over time. Anyone can get their own Orchid ID for free. And you're just seeing an example on the screen here of what an Orchid ID looks like. And this Orchid ID belongs to our volunteer researcher today, Sophia. And you'll notice that the Orchid ID looks like a link. And that's because it is. Orchid IDs link to what we call Orchid records. So if we were to click on Sophia's Orchid ID link, we're taken to Sophia's Orchid record, which is populated with information about her, similar to what we might see on a CV or resume, like her employment information, her educational background. You can also see on the left side that she has some additional information about herself, like other names or name formations she has used, websites and social links, her country, other identifiers, and her email address. And then if we scroll down on her Orchid record, we can see that she also has some membership and service work listed, funding that she's received, research resources that she has used, and last but not least, a list of publications and other works that have come from her research. And there are a few other data elements that could be included on an Orchid record that we did not see here, and that's things like invited positions and distinctions, and also peer review activity. So important to note is that for each piece of information on an Orchid record, the individual has full control over the visibility of their data. So when a user is logged into their Orchid record, they can adjust their visibility settings, and those range from 3 options, including a public visibility setting where everyone online can see that information. There's also a private visibility setting so that only the individual can see that information. And then finally, there is a trusted parties only setting. And that's where only individuals and organizations that the user designates as a trusted party can see that information. And I'll talk a little bit more about what a trusted party is in just a little bit. So knowing that an Orchid record can contain all of these different types of information about an individual and their affiliations and contributions, it's important to also have an idea of how this information gets populated on an individual's Orchid record. So individuals can add all of their information to their own Orchid record when they're logged in at orchid.org. And in doing so, the source of their information that they entered will appear as their name. So what you're seeing highlighted here is the source of this employment entry as the name of the person. So that means that Sophia entered this information herself. And so it's possible to do that for all of the different areas of the Orchid record. But for the funding and the works sections of Orchid, because these areas can tend to be a little more complex, there are a few tools that are built into Orchid to make this process easier. And those are namely the Orchid search and link wizards, which are basically databases that the user can connect with to search for either their past funding or past publications, to have those items added to their Orchid record without having to manually type in that information. So that is another option for users to try to quickly populate some of this information in their Orchid record. But there's also another way that information can be added to Orchid records, and that is by trusted organizations. So trusted organizations are basically organizations that are Orchid members and are using the Orchid API, which stands for Application Programming Interface. And they're using that in their systems in order to read data from or write data to their affiliated researchers' Orchid records. And so this is where Orchid for Organizations comes into play. And what you're seeing here on this slide is just a few examples of situations where a trusted organization has added information to an individual's ORCID record, in which case the source of that information appears as the name of the organization. And so this approach lends a little bit more authority to the information that is in somebody's ORCID record. So thinking more about ORCID for organizations and some of the benefits here. Now, when you think about the wider landscape of activities that a researcher is involved in, they're employed at, say, a university or a research institute or agency. They get funding to work on specific research. They do that research and then they publish the results. And then they typically have to report on their activities to their employer and also report back to the organization that provided the funding. And while this diagram is very simplistic, as more and more researchers work with more and more organizations, it can get very complex. So when researchers have an Orchid ID, and they have their information populated in their ORCID record, ORCID can help to streamline any kind of application and reporting processes, both for the researchers and also for the organizations that they work with. So ORCID member organizations can integrate ORCID into digital platforms and workflows in order to reduce administrative burden and connect to researchers' ORCID records with local systems, such as institutional repositories, publishing platforms, HR systems, grant applications, etc. So in this graphic, you can see the researcher at the center with their ORCID ID and their ORCID record. And then the organizations that the researcher works with are able to connect with the researcher through their ORCID ID to get information about the researcher, but also to add relevant authoritative information to the researcher's ORCID record for them. And the idea is that the researcher or the organizations that they work with can populate information in their ORCID record once, and then that data from ORCID can be reused when researchers have to provide that information to other organizations. And so that brings up the phrase, enter once, reuse often. And really, the more people and organizations that are using ORCID, the more everyone can benefit. It really does work like an ecosystem with all of the different stakeholders playing a role. And so basically, ORCID's technical infrastructure enables a streamlined flow of information about researchers and their activities across the research ecosystem. So on the left here, you have researchers getting their own ORCID IDs and populating their ORCID records with information. In the middle, you can see that ORCID stores all of these researcher ORCID records in what we call the ORCID registry. And then on the right, organizations can connect with the ORCID registry and access information about their researchers and also add information to researchers' ORCID records. And what makes this possible is, again, the ORCID API, which stands for Application Programming Interface. And that allows organizations to connect with the ORCID registry directly through local systems. And basically, that allows organizations to, again, read data from researchers' ORCID records and pull that information into your local systems. And also, the API allows organizations to write data to researchers' ORCID records. And researchers authorize this connection when they use the systems that are ORCID enabled. And so just to give you an example of what that authorization looks like, when a researcher goes to interact with a system that is integrated with ORCID, they will be asked to authorize access. So what you're seeing on this authorize access screen, this example is from DataCite, but it works the same for any organization that has the ORCID API enabled. The organization is basically asking the researcher for permission to connect with their ORCID record, and then the user will authorize that access. Basically authorizing the organization as a trusted party. And so ORCID can be integrated with many different kinds of systems. The ones that you see here on the list are kind of the most common types of systems that organizations are integrating with Orchid. So any institutional identity management systems, current research information management, grant management, human resources, institutional repositories, publishing platforms, peer review, data management platforms. These are just a few examples. And there's more information and links in your handout about the different kinds of systems. And in general, the kind of integration possibilities will vary depending on the specific software that you're using for these systems and whether that is a vendor system or maybe open source or custom. So there are some considerations around integrating the Orchid API with different kinds of systems, and it really can vary depending on your specific context. We'll talk a little bit more about the API integration towards the end. But basically, the main thing to remember about kind of the benefits of Orchid for organizations is that Orchid essentially makes it easier for organizations to keep track of things like sponsored programs and research outputs and other activities that your researchers are involved in. And Orchid does this by providing a shared, persistent way for organizations to uniquely identify researchers and stay connected with alumni over time, streamline collection of data about researchers and their activities for assessment and gauging impact, confirming affiliations with researchers in the wider research landscape, and ultimately all of this is designed to allow both organizations and individual researchers to save time and have a reduced administrative burden. So at the most basic level, the Orchid ID number distinguishes researchers from each other and allows you to uniquely identify them regardless of whether multiple people share the same name or have changed or used different names over the course of their career. So what is in a name? Most names are not unique. If you've ever typed your own name into Google, you may have been surprised to see the number of results that are not related to you at all. Even if you don't have a common name, for example, I know that there are at least 2 other people out there who have my same name, and it's not very common. So many people have the same name. Many people go through changes in their name for a variety of reasons throughout their career, not to mention using different versions or different formations of their name throughout their career. So for example, with our volunteer researcher, Sophia, if we're just looking at these different name formations alone, it's really impossible to know if all of these are referring to the same person or if these are all different people. And if we're looking for a researcher named Sofia Garcia, there could be multiple people who identify with that name. But again, with Orchid, because Sophia's Orchid ID is unique, we can better distinguish her and her works and activities from other individuals. And so this really lays the foundation for being able to more accurately evaluate and assess your researchers and the impact of your programs based on the researchers that you're affiliated with and their activities and outputs, both during and after when they're working with you. And just to give you another example, this is a multi-author work where every single author has connected their Orchid ID through the publishing process here. And so if we were to click on any one of these Orchid ID icons, we would be taken to that person's Orchid record, where we could see more information about them as long as that information is populated in their Orchid record. And you can imagine if there were more than one person on this article with the same name, or if they were using initials, that, you know, the Orchid ID is very, very helpful, especially in these types of multi-author, multi-researcher situations. So Orchid also allows organizations to streamline the collection of data about researchers and their activities to more easily track progress and assess research engagement. And so essentially, you know, in order to get more of an idea of the impact that your organization is having, or just to make it easier to get information about your researchers, Orchid allows researchers to easily store and share this information about themselves, their past employment history, their educational background, the works that they've been involved in, the funding that they've received. They can share that information with organizations through their Orchid record. And so as long as your researchers have their information populated in their Orchid record, you can use the Orchid API to pull that information directly from Orchid rather than having to continually track down your researchers and ask them to fill out forms for reporting. And so, for example, there are a number of vendor research information systems, including those that you see here, that already have an Orchid API integration built in so that researchers can import their information directly from Orchid. And each of these systems is enabled with Orchid to varying degrees. But just know that if your organization is an Orchid member and you're using one of these systems, you can take advantage of the ability to allow your researchers to import their data from Orchid directly into your system. So Clarivate Analytics, Faculty 180, from Interfolio, Digital Measures, Symplectic Elements, Pure. These are all some really common systems that have the Orchid integration built in. Another example of importing data from Orchid that you might or might not be familiar with, the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and the NSF, the National Science Foundation, are also taking advantage of this streamlined data transfer in their BioSketch tool, which is called Science CV. And this is where researchers that are applying for grants from NIH and NSF can use this Science CV tool to create a BioSketch that meets their requirements. And so basically, as long as the researcher has their information filled out in their Orchid record, they can transfer their data directly into Science CV by just clicking a button rather than having to sit there and type everything into the form. And so this approach of allowing researchers to import their data directly from Orchid into other systems is really increasingly being used by all of the different stakeholder organizations in the research landscape. And it's a really helpful benefit of Orchid in that it also allows for some consistency and can eliminate things like typos and missing information. Another benefit of Orchid is that organizations can actually, again, add information to your researchers' Orchid records to confirm your relationship with researchers across the research landscape. So in addition to reading data from Orchid, Orchid organizations can write data to researchers' Orchid records so that the relationship between your organization and the researcher is clear, authoritative, and available to other organizations in the research ecosystem when they then go to pull that information from that researcher's Orchid record, for example. And this approach, as we saw earlier, is also being used by multiple stakeholders. And just to give you a little bit more of a kind of peek behind the scenes in terms of the works section of Orchid, this is a list of the top organizations that are writing works to researchers' Orchid records around the globe. So you can see that Scopus and Researcher ID and Crossref and PubMed are up at the top there. The NASA Astrophysics Data System is on there. We've got some universities on this kind of top 10 list as well. So this is just to give you an idea of the sheer number of works that organizations have been writing to Orchid. But of course, organizations can add all of the different data elements to Orchid. It just kind of depends on what makes the most sense for your organization. So again, all of this is designed to streamline existing workflows in the research arena to save time and reduce administrative burden for both researchers and research administrators, or anyone else that is involved in these workflows. And the idea is that if we can use Orchid as a central hub for storing and sharing information about researchers and their activities, we can transfer data between Orchid records and institutional systems rather than having to manually keep track or ask researchers to fill out forms over and over again. So as I mentioned earlier, Orchid integrated systems that allow data to be transferred between the system and Orchid can really save time for people, especially when you can just click on a button to transfer data from Orchid. And there are a lot of possibilities for how the time-saving benefits of Orchid can be leveraged, depending on the existing workflows and goals of your organization. And I'm just showing an example here of a Faculty 180 account where you can see there's a button to import information once the Orchid ID is connected with that system. And just to highlight this time-saving point a little bit more, over the past couple of years, various organizations that have started using Orchid in their workflows have kept track to assess how much time people are actually saving by using Orchid. And so, as you can see from this graphic, in the UK, they determined that organizations using Orchid were saving anywhere from 0.2 to 0.4 FTE per institution, just in terms of saving time, not having to track people down and figure out who is who. Also in Portugal, they determined that researchers were saving an aggregate of 100,000 hours by using Orchid to transfer data in various workflows. And in Australia, where they've really been leading the way in many regards, Orchid imports are built into many of their grant application workflows. So researchers were found to be saving anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes per grant application just from the ability to import information from their Orchid record. And then, here in the US, this quote that's in the blue shape, it's from Brooks Hansen from the American Geophysical Union, just indicating that having Orchid IDs for most of our researchers has helped in providing authoritative accounts in our various databases, ensuring accuracy in reviewer identities and helping editors find reviewers and check expertise. And so another thing I will mention about that is that I know many institutions, already have a local identifier for all of your affiliated people. But Orchid, because it's used across the globe, it does allow for that degree of interoperability and a shared identifier that can be used across organizations. So now that you know a little bit more about the benefits, let's talk about how to benefit from Orchid, because the Orchid membership is a little bit like, maybe this is not the best analogy, but it's kind of like a gym membership. You do have to take some action in order to see those benefits. It's not just an automatic thing. So really, in order to benefit from Orchid, organizations really do need to become Orchid members. And as a community-driven initiative, Orchid is sustained by a membership model through which organizations gain access to the Orchid member API and then can leverage that Orchid infrastructure to achieve the benefits that we just described. So in the US, we have actually an Orchid consortium for nonprofit organizations called the Orchid US Community. And this group was formed in 2018 as an initial partnership between Lyrasis, the Big Ten Academic Alliance, the Greater Western Library Alliance, and the Northeast Research Libraries. And we've also been working with the Health Research Alliance more recently, which is a group of nonprofit health research funders. But of course, any nonprofit organization can participate in the Orchid US community without belonging to any one of these groups. Through our consortium, member organizations receive a significantly discounted fee for membership, which is $4,800 per calendar year. And this provides access to 5 premium member Orchid API credentials that can be integrated with a variety of different systems at your organization. And our members receive both dedicated technical support as well as consulting and community support, a monthly member newsletter from Orchid with a statistics report. And most importantly, our group is focused on building a strong community of practice around Orchid in the US. So we have a lot of resources and activities that are geared towards sharing and learning together about how to get the most value from Orchid. And currently there are 141 institutional members of the Orchid US community that you can kind of see mapped out here. Most of these members are universities, but we do also have funders, research institutes, health and hospital systems, and other research-related groups like ESIP, the Earth Science Information Partners, as one example. And we have generated quite a few resources over the past few years that can be found on our website. And you can get there by going to orchid-us.org. But we have things like, webinars on specific topics, how the Orchid API works, community showcases where we hear case studies of what different members are doing with Orchid, one-pagers with talking points about Orchid and guides with tips and examples for how to approach Orchid adoption at your organization. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But there are basically a lot of resources available through our community to essentially help people plan for Orchid adoption and really think about getting the most value from Orchid. So to really benefit from Orchid, organizations need to do a little bit of strategy and planning for how to approach encouragement of Orchid adoption locally at your organization. And this includes really three main components that are described in our Orchid US Community Planning Guide. And this document is also linked in the handout. But those three main components are partnering with internal stakeholders, using the Orchid API in integrations with local systems, and also reaching out to your researchers and helping to educate them about Orchid. Now, to help with some of these things, I do want to let you know, basically when it comes to partnering with internal stakeholders, we have found that so far, because most of our members are at universities, so far it's really the libraries that have been more the leaders with respect to Orchid at an organization. But when it comes to adopting and benefiting from Orchid, the most strategic approaches rely on the libraries working together with multiple other stakeholder units on campus, such as the research office, sponsored programs, the provost office, HR, central IT, different academic units. And there's some resources about this in your handout as well. But thinking about partnering with different internal stakeholder units, this is applicable for all types of organizations, not just universities. No matter how large or small your organization is, the more stakeholders that you have on board for Orchid adoption that understand the benefits of Orchid and have a shared vision and goal, the more your organization as a whole can benefit from Orchid. And Orchid does actually have a few resources that are going to be coming very soon for members that I want to point out. And the first one I want to talk about is a member dashboard that Orchid members will be able to log into to see real-time statistics about Orchid, like how many Orchid IDs are associated with your organization's email domain. And once your organization starts working with the Orchid API, the dashboard will show details about how many Orchid IDs have been connected with your organization. You would also see things like location information on the Orchid IDs that are connected with your organization, like what you're seeing on the screen right now. But information like this can be really helpful in terms of talking to other stakeholders at your organization, helping them see what the current levels of adoption are, and building support for getting on board with Orchid adoption, basically. Now, when it comes to the technical Orchid API integration with local systems, we've seen this screen before, but I want to reiterate again that there are a lot of possibilities and options depending on the priorities at your organization and the systems that you're using. And so again, this list shows the different types of systems that most organizations choose to integrate with Orchid in order to streamline their workflows. The Orchid website does have documentation for various types of workflows. And we also have a list of common systems in the US with notes on their Orchid integration status. And so this is where the dedicated support and consultation really come into play, because each organization is unique in terms of the systems that you're using, what your goals are, your priorities. So we can really help you to determine the most strategic approach based on your own local context. And I will say again that integrating your systems with the Orchid API does take some resources, and it will depend on if you're using vendor systems. Those vendor systems will need to have the Orchid API built in. If you're using open source systems or custom systems, you will need to have a developer who can integrate the Orchid API. But just knowing that there are some potential limitations based on the systems that you're using, Orchid will be releasing soon to our consortium members a new tool that's called the Affiliation Manager. And this is designed to make it easier for Orchid member organizations to start using the Orchid API, regardless of whether you have a developer available to do an integration or whether you're using a vendor system that already supports Orchid. So this tool is designed to allow organizations to basically upload a spreadsheet with affiliation information, such as employment, education, memberships and service. Basically, that information about your researchers can be uploaded through a CSV and written to your researchers' Orchid records through this tool. And that's really going to make it easier for organizations to start using Orchid right away, regardless of what systems you're currently using. And also, we know that planning for local Orchid API integration can sometimes take a really long time. So this is going to help to bridge the gap and get organizations started using Orchid, regardless of what your technical limitations might be. And for the third point, last but certainly not least, it's never too early to make sure your researchers know about Orchid. So encouraging your researchers to get and use their Orchid ID and make sure they understand how Orchid can benefit them. Your organization does not have to be an Orchid member to start doing education and outreach to your researchers, because making sure that your researchers have an Orchid ID and at least have some information populated in their Orchid record is one of the big pieces that allows organizations to also benefit from Orchid. So all the people that are involved, all the organizations that are involved can play a role. Even if your organization is not a member, you can start doing this type of outreach. And we do have several resources to help get the word out to researchers about the benefits of Orchid for them. You'll see that there's an outreach planning guide and other materials, links from the handout. The graphic that you're seeing on the screen is just one example from Temple University of a postcard, a promotional postcard that they created with the messaging that if a researcher wants to publish with any of these publishers, they will need to have an Orchid ID. Many publishers are increasingly requiring that authors submit an Orchid ID when they submit their manuscript. And related to this, many funders are increasingly also requiring Orchid IDs. So the more you can help your researchers understand what Orchid is and how it can benefit them, the better. Now we're getting ready to wrap up here, but I just wanted to point out that for Orchid members, not only do we provide dedicated support and consultation, but we also have access to the collective wisdom of our community. And you can learn from what other organizations have done and be connected with staff at other organizations that have similar goals and contexts. Representatives from member organizations are invited to join our members discussion forum, which you're seeing a screenshot of here. And this is our main communication channel for raising questions, sharing announcements, new resources, and other topics of interest. And as you can see, there's a good amount of interaction and activity that takes place here. We also do have a listserv that is open to anyone. So even if your organization is not an Orchid member, you can still stay in the loop by joining the open listserv. And there's a link to that handout as well. I'll paste the handout again in case anyone missed that. You can join our listserv. We're also on Twitter at US Consortium. So if you follow there, you can stay in the loop. And check out our website as well. The main thing to remember, if you remember anything from this presentation, is that to really get the most benefit from Orchid membership, or if your organization isn't ready to become a member yet, there are so many resources available to help you prepare and stay in contact with us. So we have resources available. Please use them, and of course, contact us. And with that, I would love to check in on any questions or comments that people have. I'm seeing a few things in the Q&A. So I'm going to just jump into some questions here. All right, so the first question is, are trusted organizations only Orchid organizational members, or are non-Orchid organizations able to be trusted orgs as well? Great question. So trusted organizations are only Orchid members. Basically, your organization becomes a trusted organization on a researcher's Orchid record when that researcher connects their Orchid ID with your organization through the Orchid API connection. And so basically, organizations are to use the Orchid member API to make that connection with researchers and get that trusted organization status. I will mention that Orchid does have a public API that is open for anyone to use. You can use the public API if you have your own Orchid record. There's a developer tools tab. However, those API credentials for the public API are granted to individuals, whereas the member API for organizations are granted to the organization. So organizations really do need to use the member API. And I know this is a lot of kind of jargon and there's some complexities, but if you want to go more into depth with the API and how that works, definitely send me an email. I'd be more than happy to get online with you and talk more about that. There's another question, which is, are there any future plans to add an additional user category, research resource, perhaps? Our institution is a research site that does not fund researchers. We do not employ researchers, and we are not a publisher. We would still like to be able to attach our institution to the researcher so we can easily track publications on research done at our institution. Yeah, so really any institution, any organization can take advantage of the Orchid API and have the researchers that are affiliated with you connect their Orchid ID with your organization. There is a aspect of the Orchid record called research resources. So if you are making resources available to researchers, it doesn't really matter what kind of organization you are. As long as you're a nonprofit, you can join our consortium and you can connect with people's Orchid ID records. You can read information from their Orchid records, and you can add their use of your research resources to their Orchid record. So yes, there's no limit on what type of organization can use Orchid. And really, if you're not a nonprofit, you can also use Orchid, but for the purposes of our Orchid US Community Consortium, we are only able to work with nonprofits. Okay, next question. Can you please confirm whether an organization can import data from digital measures into researchers' Orchid IDs? So as of my knowledge right now, for digital measures, the functionality with Orchid is somewhat limited. With digital measures, a researcher can transfer data from their Orchid record into digital measures, but they cannot currently push information from digital measures into their Orchid record. And so Digital Measures is one of the vendors that, has the Orchid API built in, but they're not using all of the functionality that they could be using. And what we found with vendors is that the more they hear from their actual customers asking for more Orchid functionality, the more likely they will be to add that functionality in. And so there are some limitations around certain vendors because we have to rely on the vendor to enable that functionality. It is entirely possible for data to go both ways from Orchid to another system and back. But with Digital Measures right now, it's just limited to importing from Orchid into Digital Measures. Researchers currently cannot export data from Digital Measures to Orchid, and that's just a limitation on the vendor's part. So contact them and tell them you want to see that functionality. Okay, another question is, could you speak again to the researcher finding other researchers tool? Is it only members? Yeah, so the tool that's coming soon is actually just for member organizations. It's a member dashboard where organizations will be able to get some views indicating the number of people. It's going to be ballpark, but it's kind of giving you an idea of how many people at your organization have an Orchid record. And then once you start working with the API, you can see how many people have connected to it. So that tool is for organizations. It is not a public-facing tool for researchers to find other researchers. Orchid actually does not have, you can go to the Orchid website. They have a search box where you can, type in a keyword or somebody's name, and it will show you all of the Orchid records that have that information publicly available. So that's one thing. If a researcher is trying to find other researchers, they might also try using it's basically a PID graph. So it's a persistent identifier graph that DataCite is making available. I think it's called DataCite Commons. I would Google that, and you can basically, enter an Orchid ID or a DOI or an organization ID, and you can see all of the different connections. Orchid records do have a place where individual researchers can enter keywords about their research, and those are searchable at orchid.org. In the search box, you can type in a keyword like a certain discipline or certain area of research, and you'll see all of the results come up with people that also have that keyword on their Orchid record. Okay, I'm seeing another question, which is there an established API available for InfoEd, which is a grant management system? So yes, to my knowledge, InfoEd does have the Orchid API built in. However, like Digital Measures, it is somewhat limited. So as of right now, InfoEd allows an individual to simply connect their Orchid ID with their profile in InfoEd, but no additional data is transferred back and forth. It's literally just taking that person's Orchid ID number and authenticating it and pasting it on their InfoEd profile. So somebody can't import data from Orchid into InfoEd or export data from InfoEd to Orchid at this time. Again, I would recommend contacting InfoEd and telling them that this is functionality that you want to see, because it is entirely possible. InfoEd just has to implement that. And now I'm seeing a question about Phoebe or Phoebe. I don't know. I've never come across this, so I don't know the answer to this. But if you search Phoebe and Orchid, which I'm doing right now on my phone, it should give you some results if it is connected. If it is a vendor system or some other platform, I would contact them directly and just ask. But the fact that I haven't heard of it, it's likely that they are not using Orchid yet. because I am familiar with most of the systems that are using Orchid, and that's completely on my radar as new systems start using Orchid. So I would guess that no, they don't, but you might double check that by contacting them directly. Phoebe, F-I-B-I. I have not heard of it. Sorry about that. I'm seeing another chat. Okay. One important issue for us is that the data in Orchid is not validated. A researcher can basically add whatever they want, but they can manually enter information. Yes. When they do so, they often leave off their co-authors. So although we do have the import from Orchid enabled, we put all the entries into a holding category, and we are very slowly working our way through the entries to see if there's something we're missing. Okay, so basically the main point of this question is exactly correct, which is that individual users can add whatever information they want to their Orchid record. Orchid does not check to verify if that information is accurate or not. So that's kind of a very similar situation to any type of CV or resume workflow, where, you know, theoretically somebody could make a lot of claims that may or may not be true. And that's where we really are trying to encourage more organizations to add information to people's Orchid records so that the data is more authoritative. Also, we're encouraging people to, as much as possible, use other identifiers like DOIs, digital object identifiers, especially for things like works, research data, other types of outputs, so that there's some sort of way to verify that information. Now, when it comes to co-authors, if somebody is manually entering work information into their Orchid record, there is not a field for them to indicate co-authors. Orchid had done that in the past. It didn't actually work so well, again, due to the name ambiguation issue. And so that is something that Orchid is still grappling with. Works that are added to somebody's Orchid record through the API, you can add co-author information to those, but manual entries, people cannot add their co-authors. So that is a little bit of a limitation. But again, with the use of DOIs, because all of that co-author information can be included in DOI metadata, that's really the preferable mechanism. And Orchid is currently working on, if a work does have a DOI, grabbing the metadata, especially the co-author information from the DOI metadata, and pulling that through to have it appear on the Orchid record entry. So there are some considerations around these issues that, you know, there are some best practices that we're trying to encourage to make everything more authoritative and trustworthy. And so things are moving in that direction. And so we're hoping to have more of that coworker information and use of DOIs and other identifiers more prevalent. Okay, and then I'm seeing another question, which is, can Orchid information go into or be imported from academic analytics? So academic analytics, last I checked, which was relatively recently, they are a member organization of Orchid. So they do have the ability to use the Orchid API. However, they have not implemented that in their system yet. From what I have been told, if your organization is using academic analytics, you can give them a list of Orchid IDs for people at your organization and they can import those, but they're not reading or writing any data and they're not using the API right now. But this is another one where the more they hear from their customers, the more likely they will add that ability. So I would say, if you're interested in academic analytics or you're using academic analytics, please contact them and say that you want to see them use the Orchid API. All right, are there any others? you have any other questions, you can chat them to me or put them into that Q&A box. I really appreciate all these very thoughtful questions. Thank you so much. And again, this recording will be sent out. And you should have gotten the handout on the attachment to the email that came out, but just in case you didn't, I'll paste it again because that's where all the really handy links are, including joining the listserv. And of course, you're seeing the email address here on the screen, orchidus@lyrasis.org. Feel free to email that if any questions do come up. You can also email me directly. I just pasted that into the chat. So this is my direct email address. If you want to talk more about any of this, if you have questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Any other questions going once? I'll stay on until the hour, just in case somebody is typing. But thanks, everyone. Really appreciate that you chose to spend time with me today to listen about Orchid. I hope this was helpful. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Absolutely. Thanks so much. Have a great day. All right, I think we're good to go. Thanks everyone. Thanks for chatting me.